Have you ever stared at one of those classic optical illusions? You know, the ones...
Right, like the vase or the two faces.
Yeah, exactly. You look at the exact same arrangement of ink on a piece of paper, and your brain instantly sees this beautiful, elegant vase.
Right.
But the person standing right next to you looks at the exact same page, and, they swear up and down that they're looking at two faces in profile.
Well, I mean, it's all about how your brain processes the negative space, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What you choose to foreground and what you subconsciously push to the back, that completely dictates your reality in that moment.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today's deep dive is essentially about the literary equivalent of that optical illusion. Welcome. We are so glad you're here with us today.
We really are. We've got a wild one today.
We do. Our mission today is to dissect a massive literary juggernaut.
Yeah.
We're talking about Hanya Yanagihara's 2015 novel, A Little Life.
Such a huge book.
It is a massive 800-page brick of a book. And we're pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources today. Critical literary essays, various author interviews, and this deeply comprehensive review by Constance Grady over at Vox.
Yeah, that Vox review is fantastic, by the way.
It really is. So we are going to use all of this to understand how this book became a beloved, award-nominated phenomenon, while simultaneously becoming maybe one of the most polarizing and controversial novels of the decade.
The core paradox here is genuinely fascinating, I think. We are looking at a novel that many literary critics agree delivers a fundamentally nihilistic and, well, hopeless message.
Yeah, totally hopeless.
It actively refuses to offer its protagonist any real redemption. There's no light at the end of the tunnel.
None.
Yet somehow it didn't just find a niche audience, it became an absolute commercial smash hit. I mean, it was shortlisted for both the Booker Prize and the National Book Award.
Which is wild for a book this dark.
Right, and you see readers frequently describing it as the best yet saddest book they have ever read in their entire lives.
And depending on how you squint at this book, going back to that optical illusion, you either see a profound, transcendent meditation on the limits of empathy.
Or you look at the exact same 800 pages and see an exploitative, emotionally manipulative exercise in what some call torture porn.
Torture porn, yeah. That's a heavy accusation.
It is, and to understand how we arrive at such an extreme critical divide, we first have to examine the book's narrative architecture. The author essentially executes this massive, prolonged bait and switch on the reader.
Oh, it's quite the pivot. Because if you pick this up knowing nothing, it starts off reading like a very familiar, almost comforting setup.
Very familiar.
You've got these 4 college friends moving to New York City, right? And each of them represents a different facet of ambition and identity.
Right. You've got Malcolm, who is this reserved biracial architect from a wealthy Upper East Side family.
Yep. Then you have JB, the ambitious Haitian-American artist who struggles with addiction and professional jealousy.
And then there's Willem, the incredibly handsome, kind-hearted actor from Wyoming.
And finally, Jude, this brilliant mathematical prodigy who becomes a fearsome corporate litigator. So you read the first 100 pages and you think, oh, I know what this is. This is a quintessential post-college coming-of-age story.
But that's the trap.
Yeah.
You are conditioned to expect a narrative about their intertwined careers, their romances, their shifting loyalties as they navigate their 20s and 30s. But the reveal, which happens gradually and then, all at once, is that the true protagonist of this novel isn't actually this quartet of friends.
No, not at all.
The true protagonist is Jude's trauma. He becomes the gravitational center around which everything else orbits.
And what a trauma it is.
As the narrative unfolds, the author details just an unspeakable past. We learn Jude was orphaned and raised in a monastery where he suffered horrific, systematic physical, sexual, and psychological torture at the hands of the brothers.
And it just spirals from there. I mean, he escapes that nightmare only to be subjected to further severe exploitation by this predatory psychologist named Dr. Traylor.
Yep.
And Traylor ultimately runs Jude over with a car, leaving him with severe chronic pain, spinal injuries, and lifelong physical disabilities.
It is a staggering, suffocating amount of tragedy to heap onto one single character.
It really is. And honestly, looking at that, I have to push back on the fundamental structure of the book.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the trauma itself is the central character, do the other 3 friends even matter? Or are they just props in Jude's tragedy?
That is a very fair question.
Because if the focus is so intensely on Jude's suffering, it feels like the others might just be window dressing, a bright backdrop designed specifically to make his pain look even darker by contrast.
That's a very sharp critique, and it's one that surfaces frequently in the critical essays we reviewed for today. The character development is undeniably, and perhaps intentionally, uneven.
Uneven is a good word for it.
Yeah, JB and Malcolm in particular receive significantly less psychological depth than Jude and Willem. Some critics have actively questioned their underlying purpose in the second half of the narrative.
Because they kind of fade out, right?
Exactly. They cease to be fully realized individuals with their own equal weight in the story. Instead, they function more as satellites orbiting Jude's pain. They literally just exist to react to him.
So what does this all mean for the actual arc of the story?
Hmm.
Since Jude's trauma is the undeniable engine of this book, it forces us to look at how Yanagihara uses that trauma to completely upend our expectations as readers.
Right.
Usually in literature, when a character is broken, there is a clear, telegraphed path to putting them back together.
That's the standard literary formula, yes. The
Yeah.
hero's journey of recovery, basically.
Exactly. But Yanagihara refuses that comfort entirely.
She really does. Instead, she uses Jude's body as a literal archive of that trauma. This isn't just abstract, invisible psychological pain. It is made violently literal on the page.
It is so visceral.
Jude's physical disabilities, his severe limp, his chronic agony, his eventual reliance on canes and wheelchairs, these are inescapable, highly visible manifestations of the wounds he carries inside. And then, of course, you have the novel's deeply graphic depictions of self-harm.
Right. Jude regularly uses razors to cut himself. And rather than framing this simply as a symptom to be cured, the text portrays it as a complex, desperate coping mechanism.
And we have to look at the psychology behind why the author makes this choice.
Right.
When a person's body has been commodified, controlled, and violated by others since childhood, they are entirely stripped of bodily autonomy. The self-harm, tragically, becomes Jude's way of seizing back control.
Oh, wow. So he is deciding when and how his body hurts.
Exactly. It's a destructive loop, obviously, but in his mind, it's the only way to maintain some semblance of ownership over a body he views as fundamentally tainted.
It's so devastating. And if you think about traditional literary character arcs, like we said, they usually follow that hero's journey of recovery.
Right.
The character hits rock bottom, they finally go to therapy, they accept the unconditional love of their friends, they do the hard work, and eventually that love saves the day. They heal.
But Yanagihara entirely rejects this formula. She traps Jude in a closed loop. He is a mathematical prodigy, and he applies his favorite mathematical axiom to his own life, that x always equals x.
Oh, that phrase.
The psychology of x always equals x is perhaps the most devastating concept in the book. Because of his trauma, his brain constantly seeks predictable patterns. He views his life through rigid, unchangeable logic.
Right, so he thinks he can't change.
Exactly. He believes his identity is permanently fixed in suffering, that he was essentially born for abuse, that he is inherently bad or ruined. In his mind, if you are X, then adding a new environment or adding a loving partner cannot magically turn you into Y.
You will always revert to X.
Always. Which brings us to the most controversial theme of the entire novel, the insistence that survival does not equal healing. What's fascinating here is how the Vox critic, Constance Grady, pointed out this exact discomfort.
Yeah, Grady's point was brilliant.
She noted that the novel actively argues against the modern pillars of mental health recovery. It argues that talk therapy simply does not help Jude. Endless financial support doesn't help.
The deepest, most patient romantic relationships don't help.
Right. The horrifying conclusion the text drives toward is that some pain simply cannot be healed, and the only escape from the loop is death. It's a frankly nihilistic view of the human condition.
It is a brutal realization for the reader. We are so heavily trained by pop culture and traditional storytelling to expect that love cures all. We want the payoff for witnessing the suffering.
We really do. We feel like we're owed a happy ending.
And because Jude is so completely trapped internally in that closed loop of suffering, the author creates this wildly jarring contrast with his external life. It is almost surreal. She elevates Jude and his friends to the absolute pinnacle of external worldly success.
They achieve a level of wealth and status that is almost astronomical. It completely detaches them from the realities of normal life.
I mean, we're talking lavish, impromptu international trips, multiple luxury homes filled with custom furniture, high-end designer brands, seamlessly woven into their daily lives.
Yeah, it's extreme.
Jude becomes this renowned, incredibly wealthy corporate lawyer. Willem becomes a massive A-list movie star recognized globally. JB is a celebrated artist with gallery shows, and Malcolm is a highly sought-after architect.
They essentially conquer New York and the world.
But the review points out the massive disconnect here. All that external achievement, all that money and fame cannot fill Jude's internal void.
It creates the classic gilded cage. And within that cage of extreme wealth, the novel places immense, almost religious weight on the concept of chosen family.
Yes, the chosen family aspect is huge.
Despite the overwhelming darkness, the book deeply celebrates the bonds between these four men. There is a line from the text that perfectly captures this sentiment. The author asks, "Wasn't friendship its own miracle, the finding of another person who made the entire lonely world seem somehow less lonely?"
Oh, it is a genuinely beautiful quote. And to be fair, you do see these profound, sustained acts of care playing out over the decades they are friends.
You really do.
You have Malcolm, quietly, without being asked, designing accessible living spaces to accommodate Jude's worsening physical limitations. You have Willem offering this vast, patient, unconditional romantic love, literally putting his own glamorous life on hold to care for Jude.
And Harold and Julia.
Yes, Harold and Julia Stein, Jude's former law professor and his wife, who actually adopt Jude as a full-grown adult in his 30s. They go through the legal process just to give him the parental anchor he was robbed of as a child.
And Andy, his fiercely dedicated doctor who makes house calls and treats both his physical and psychological wounds, acting almost as a guardian.
But, and this is a big but,
As the critical essays we've reviewed are careful to point out, this miracle of friendship is simultaneously portrayed as a crushing burden.
it really is.
It is endlessly exhausting for his friends to constantly keep Jude alive, constantly monitoring his moods, constantly bandaging his self-inflicted wounds. And for Jude, being the recipient of all this tireless care induces deep, unrelenting shame.
Right, because he feels guilty for being a burden.
Exactly. It creates a terrible, inescapable cycle. The care sustains his life, but the shame of needing that care fuels his self-hatred, leading to more self-harm, which requires more care. It just exhausts everyone involved.
I have to admit, I struggle with this setting as a reader. I want to ask you listening to consider this. Think about your own favorite fictional characters. Usually when they suffer, it's tied to survival in some way, paying rent, keeping a job, navigating a broken healthcare system.
Right. Real-world problems.
Does giving these characters unlimited money and unparalleled success undermine the emotional reality of the story? It almost feels like they are suffering in a vacuum or a sterile laboratory, completely insulated from everyday reality.
It's a very fair point.
When your personal doctor makes midnight house calls to your custom-designed multi-million-dollar loft, does that make the pain less relatable?
That is a very common critique among literary reviewers. By stripping away the mundane struggles of survival, the author isolates the emotional and psychological pain. She puts Jude's mind in a petri dish so we can examine the trauma without any external distractions.
A petri dish, yeah.
But for some readers, yes, that level of extreme privilege makes the suffering feel artificial. It becomes so hyper-specific to their exceptional circumstances that it loses its grounding in the real world.
And that mixture of extreme privilege and extreme suffering leads us right into the massive critical divide. How did the world react to this relentless darkness? Because people have very, very strong feelings about this book. There's almost no middle ground.
Oh, it's deeply polarizing. On the side of praise, you have a massive, passionate fan base. Readers are devastated by the sheer emotional power of the book.
Right, they love it.
Many celebrate its dignified representation of queer relationships, particularly the slow, tender evolution of Jude and Willem's romance. And for a lot of readers, the profound exploration of found family really resonates.
It's a masterclass in emotional resonance for them.
Exactly, creating characters so vivid and lived in that readers feel a genuine grief when the book ends.
But surely that level of relentless misery alienates as many people as it comforts. You can't put a reader through an 800-page meat grinder without some serious critical pushback.
Absolutely not, and the backlash is fierce. The most common accusation is that the book crosses the line into trauma porn.
Use that phrase again.
Critics argue that the sheer relentless accumulation of horrors, child abuse, sexual violence, physical torture, chronic illness, abandonment, and vehicular assault pushes the narrative past genuine exploration and into melodramatic emotional manipulation.
And there are specific representation concerns, too, particularly from the LGBTQ+ community, right?
Yes. When you look at the wider critical reception, particularly from gay male critics, some question whether Yanagihara, who is a straight woman adequately or authentically portrayed gay identity.
Interesting. What was the specific critique there?
The critique is that the characters lack a lived sense of being gay, being outsiders. The world they inhabit seems completely devoid of homophobia or the cultural touchstones of the gay community in New York.
Huh.
Furthermore, some critics pointed out a disturbing pattern in the text, a continuous, almost exclusive association between gay men and pedophilia or predation throughout the various traumas Jude endures. It raised serious discussions about the tropes being employed.
Here's where it gets really interesting, regarding the actual craft of the writing. Let's look at how Yanagihara structurally manipulates the reader.
Oh, the structure is fascinating.
A lot of critics found the pacing of the narrative to be engineered specifically to inflict maximum psychological damage. The nonlinear flashbacks to Jude's horrific abuse don't just emerge naturally, they are deployed strategically.
Very strategically.
Just when Jude is experiencing a moment of peace, say, a quiet Thanksgiving dinner with his found family, the narrative violently rips you back into a 20-page graphic flashback of his childhood torture. It trains the reader to actively dread happiness.
Really does.
Plus, there's the length. At 800 pages, some call it self-indulgent, arguing she just wanted to write a punishingly long book to wear the reader down.
And we have to discuss the pivotal climax of the novel, the sudden death of Willem in a random car accident.
Oh man, that part.
From a craft perspective, this has been heavily criticized. Many readers and reviewers felt it wasn't a natural narrative progression. Instead, it felt like a cruel, authorial intervention.
Yeah, it felt so forced.
Willem is Jude's ultimate anchor, the one thing keeping him tethered to life. His abrupt death feels designed specifically to destroy that lifeline and force Jude into his final fatal collapse.
I look at it like a rigged carnival game. You know, the ones where the hoops are just slightly smaller than the basketball?
Exactly, yes.
No matter how perfectly you throw it, the ball is never going to fit. That's Jude's life. No matter what choices Jude makes, no matter how much unconditional love he receives from Willem or how fiercely Harold protects him, the author's predetermined narrative arc ensures he is always going to lose.
The game was rigged.
The hoops are too small. The game was rigged against him from page one, just waiting for the author to pull the final lever.
This raises an important question regarding the fundamental ethics of storytelling. What is the responsibility of an author when depicting severe trauma?
Right.
Defenders of the book argue that sanitizing trauma is dishonest. They argue that the ugliness must be shown with absolute clinical precision so we don't look away from the realities of a pulse.
Great. But critics ask a different question. When does depicting suffering cross the line into wallowing in it?
Exactly. Does the book aestheticize pain?
Let's break that down. Does the book aestheticize pain? Meaning, does it treat his suffering like a beautiful, tragic painting to be stared at in a museum rather than a brutal reality to be survived? Is it turning his agony into an art exhibit for our entertainment?
That's exactly the debate. Are we being asked to empathize, or are we being asked to simply spectate his destruction?
So bringing it all back to you listening,
Yeah.
what is the final verdict on this 800-page behemoth? The Vox review by Constance Grady ultimately gives it a 4 out of 5, calling it a flawed masterpiece of emotional engineering.
Flawed masterpiece is the perfect way to describe it.
It is a book that is as troubling as it is beautiful.
It's a novel that arguably succeeds most beautifully, not in the grand, sweeping tragedies, but in the quiet, mundane moments of survival.
Like what?
Well, the simple acts of the four friends cooking dinner together or sitting in a living room supporting each other through minor crises. That's where Yanagihara captures something very true about human endurance, that we survive through small, repeated acts of care and presence.
But the critical consensus, from many sources, suggests it fails in its final message. By absolutely insisting that Jude cannot be saved, the book risks reinforcing deeply harmful real-world stigmas.
Specifically, the idea that victims of severe abuse are inherently unfixable or permanently broken.
Right. As one survivor pointed out in the essays we reviewed, trauma survivors don't need an 800-page book telling them they can't be fixed. It's a message that feels like a profound betrayal of the book's own earlier celebration of human connection.
And because of that, we need to issue a very clear warning based on the material we've discussed today.
Yes, please.
If you are considering reading this book, you need to know exactly what you are walking into. It contains incredibly graphic, clinical descriptions of child abuse, sexual violence, domestic violence, self-harm, and suicide.
It is not a book to be approached lightly, and readers with any history of trauma should approach it with serious, serious caution. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to mull over. It goes back to that optical illusion we talked about at the beginning and how our brains process what we see.
Right.
If we as an audience are so deeply conditioned to expect our stories to end with recovery, with a neat little bow of growth, healing, and closure, what does our intense discomfort with Jude's lack of healing actually reveal about us?
Are we demanding that fictional trauma survivors do the hard work of getting better just so that we, the readers, can close the book and feel safer in the real world?
Does a character owe us their recovery? Next time you find yourself staring at an optical illusion or looking for the light at the end of a very dark story, ask yourself, whose comfort is that light really for?